Chapter 7. The Episode of the Barrel. The police had brought a cab with him, and in this I escorted Miss Morstan back to her home. After the angelic fashion of women, she had borne trouble with a calm face as long as there was someone weaker than herself to support, and I had found her bright and placid by the side of the frightened housekeeper. In the cab, however, she first turned faint, then burst into a passion of weeping, so sorely had she been tried by the adventures of the night. She had told me since that she thought me cold and distant upon the journey. She had guessed the struggle within my breast, or the efforts of self-restraint which held me back. My sympathies and my love went out for her, even as my hand had in the garden. I felt that years of the conventionalities of life could not teach me to know her sweet, brave nature as she had one day in the strange experiences. Yet there were two thoughts which sealed the words of affection upon my lips. She was weak and helpless, shaken in mind and nerve. It was to take her at a disadvantage to obtrude love upon her at such a time. Worse still, she was rich. If Holmes' researches were correct, she would be an heiress. If she was fair, it was honorable, and that half-pay surgeons should take such advantage of an intimacy which chance had brought about. Might she not look upon me as a mere vulgar fortune-seeker? I could not bear the risk of such a thought should cross her mind. This Agra treasure intervened like an impassable barrier between us. It was nearly 2 o'clock when we reached Mrs. Cecil Forrester's house. The servants had retired hours ago, but Miss Forrester had been so interested in the strange message which Miss Morstan had received that she sat up in the hope of her return. She opened the door herself, a middle-aged, graceful woman, and it gave me joy to see how tenderly warm she stole her arms around the other's waist, and how motherly was she in voice when she greeted her. She was clearly no mere paid dependent, but an honored friend. I was introduced, and Mrs. Forrester earnestly begged me to step in and to tell her of our adventures. I explained, however, that the importance of my errand, and promised faithfully to call and report any progress which we might make with the case. As we drove away, I stole a glance back, and I still seemed to see that little group on the step. Two graceful, clinging figures, the half-open doors, the hall light shining through the stained glass of the barometer, and the bright stair rods. It was soothing to catch even the passing glimpse of the tranquil English home in the midst of the wild, dark business which had absorbed us. And the more I thought of what was happening, the wilder and darker it grew. I reviewed the whole extraordinary sequence of events as I rattled through the silent, gaslit streets. There was the original problem. That, at least, was pretty clear now. The death of Captain Morstan, the sending of the pearls, the advertisements, the letter. We had had light upon all those events. We had only led us, however, to the deeper and far more tragic mystery. The Indian treasure, the curious plan found among Morstan's baggage, the strange scene at Major Sholto's death, the rediscovery of the treasure immediately followed by the murder of the discoverer, the very singular accompaniments of crime, the footsteps, the remarkable weapons, the words upon the card corresponding with those of Captain Morstan's chart. Here was, indeed, a labyrinth in which the man less singularly endowed than my fellow lodger might well despair of ever finding the clues. Pinchet Lane was a row of shabby two-storied brick homes in the lower quarter of Lambeth. I had to knock for some time at number 3 before I could make any impression. At last, however, there was a glint in the candle behind the blind, and a face looked out of the upper window. "Go away, you drunken vagabond," said the face. If you kick up any more now, I'll open the kennels and let out all 43 dogs upon you. If you let one out, it's just what I would have come for, said I. Go on, yelled the voice. So help me gracious, I have a wiper in a bag and I'll drop your dead end if you don't hook it. But I want a dog, I cried. I won't be argued with, shouted Mr. Sherman. Now stand clear, for when I say 3, down goes the wiper. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I began, but the words had the most magical effect, for the window instantly slammed down, and within a moment the door was unbarred and opened. Mr. Sherman was a lanky, lean old man, with stooping shoulders, a stringy neck, and blue-tinted glasses. A friend of Sherlock Holmes is always welcome, said he. Step in, sir. Keep clear of the badger, for he bites. Oh, naughty, naughty. Would you take a nip for the gentleman? This is to a stout, which thrusts his wicked head and red eyes between the bars of his cage. Don't mind that, sir. It's only to a slow worm. It ain't got no fangs, and if it gives you run of the room, for it keeps the beetles down. You must not mind me being just a little short with you at first, for I guard at the children, and there's many a one comes down this lane to knock me up. What was it that Mr. Sherlock Holmes wanted, sir? He wanted a dog of yours. Excuse me. Ah, that would be Toby. Yes, Toby was the name. Toby lives at number 7 on the left there. He moved slowly forward with his candle among the queer animal family which he had gathered around him. In the uncertain, shadowy light, I could see dimly that there were glancing, glimmering eyes peeping out from every cranny and corner. Even the rafters above our heads were lined with solemn fowls, who lazily shifted their weight from one leg to the other, as their voices disturbed their slumbers. Toby proved to be an ugly, long-haired, lop-eared creature, half spaniel and half lurcher. Brown and white in color, with a very clumsy, waddling gait. It accepted, after some hesitation, a clump of sugar from the old naturalist, handed to me, and having thus sealed an alliance, it followed me to the cab, and made no difficulties about accompanying me. It had just struck 3 on the palace clock when I found myself back once more at Pondicherry Lodge. The ex-prize fighter McMurdo had, I found, been arrested as an accessory, and both he and Mr. Sholto had been marched off to the station. 2 constables guarded the narrow gate, but they allowed me to pass with the dog, on my mentioning the detective's name. Holmes was standing at the doorstep, with his hands in his pockets, smoking his pipe. "Ah, you have him there," he said. "Good dog, then. Athelo Jones is gone. We have had an immense display of energy since you left. He arrested not only friend Thaddeus, but the gatekeeper, the housekeeper, the Indian servant. We have the place to ourselves, but for a sergeant upstairs. Leave the dog here and come up." We tied Toby to the hall table and reascended the stairs. The room was as we had left it, save for sheets had been draped over the central figure. A weary-looking police officer reclined in the corner. "Lend me a bull's-eye, Sergeant," said my companion. "Now tie a bit of cord around my neck, as to hang it in front of me. Thank you. Now I must kick off my boots and stockings. Just you carry them with you, Mr. Watson. And I am going to do a little climbing, and dip my handkerchief into the kerosene. Ah, that will do. Now come up into the garret with me for a moment." We clambered up through the hole. Holmes turned his light once more upon the footsteps in the dust. "I wish you to particularly notice these footmarks," he said. "Do you observe anything noteworthy about them?" "They belong," said I, "to a child or a small woman." "Apart from their size, though, is nothing else?" They appeared to be much as other footsteps. Not at all. Look here. Look at this print on the right foot in the dust. Now make one with my naked foot beside it. What is the chief difference? Your toes are all cramped together. The other print has each toe distinctly divided. Quite so. That is the point. Bear that in mind. Now, would you so kindly step over that flap window and smell the edge of the woodwork? I shall stay over here, so you can have a handkerchief in my hand. As I did as directed, I was instantly conscious of a strong, tarty smell. That is where he put his foot in getting out. If you can trace him, I should think that Toby will give no difficulty. Now run downstairs, loose the dog, and look for the Blondin. By that time I got out of the grounds, Sherlock Holmes was on the roof. I could see him like an enormous glowworm crawling very slowly along the edge. I lost sight of him behind a stack of chimneys, but he presently reappeared, and then vanished once more behind the opposite side. When I made my way around, I found him seated in one of the corner eaves. "Is that you, Watson?" he cried. "Yes. This is the place. What is the black thing down there?" "Water barrel." "On top of it?" "Yes." "No sign of a ladder?" "No." "That confounded the fellow. It's the most breakneck place. I ought to be able to come down where he could climb up. The water pipe feels pretty firm. Here goes anyhow." There was a scuffling of feet, and the lantern began to come steadily down the side of the wall. When the light spring came up on the barrel, and from there to the earth. It was easy to follow him, he said, lodging the stockings on the boots. "Tiles will loosen the whole way along, and he is in a hurry he dropped this. It confirms my diagnosis, as your doctors express it." The object which he held up to me was a small pocket or woven pouch out of colored grasses, and with very few tawdry beads strung around it. The size and shape of it was not unlike a cigarette case. Inside were half a dozen spines of dark wood, sharp at one end and rounded on the other, like that which had struck Bartholomew's. "They are the hellish things," he said. "Look out that you don't prick yourself. I'm delighted to have them, for the chances that they are still all that he has. There is less to fear for you from me finding our skin along one. I would sooner face a martini bullet myself. Are you game for a 6-mile trudge, Watson?" "Certainly," I answered. "Your leg will stand it?" "Oh, yes." "Here you are, doggy. Good old Toby. Smell it, Toby. Smell it." He pushed the creosote handkerchief under the dog's nose, while the creature stood with its fluffy legs separated, and the most comical look on his head, like a connoisseur sniffing a bouquet of a famous vintage. Holmes then threw the handkerchief at some distance and fastened a stout cord to the mongrel's collar, and then led him to the foot of the water barrel. The creature instantly broke into a succession of high, tremulous yelps, and with his nose to the ground, his tail in the air, he padded off upon the trail at a pace which strained his leash, and kept us at our top speed. The east had been gradually whitening, and we could now see some distance in the cold gray light. The square, massive house, with its black, empty windows, whose high, bare walls towered up, sad and forlorn, behind us. Of course, led right across the grounds, in and out among the trenches and pits which they were scarred and intersected. The whole place, with its scattered dirt heaps and its ill-grown shrubs, had a blighted, ill-omened look which harmonized with the black tragedy which hung over it. On reaching the boundary wall, Toby ran along, whining eagerly, underneath its shadow, and stopped finally in a corner screened by a young beech. Where the two walls joined, several bricks had been loosened, and the crevices were worn down and rounded upon the lower edge, as though they had frequently been used as a ladder. Holmes clambered up, and taking the dog from me, he dropped it upon the other side. "There's the print of a wooden leg in hand," he remarked as he mounted up beside him. "You see the slight smudge of blood upon the white plaster. What a lucky thing it was that we had no heavy rain since yesterday. The scent will lie upon the ground in spite of the 80 and 20 hours." I confess that I had my doubts when I reflected upon the great traffic which had passed along the London road in the interval. My fears had soon appeased, however. Toby never hesitated or swerved, but waddled in his particular rolling fashion. Clearly, the pungent smell of the kerosene rose high above all contending senses. "Do not imagine," said Holmes, "that I depend for my success upon the case of the mere chance of one of these fellows hanging out with his foot at the chemical. I have knowledge now which will enable me to trace him in many different ways. This, however, is the readiest, and since fortune has put it into our hands, I should copulate if I neglected it." It was, however, presented the case of becoming a pretty little intellectual problem which it at one time promised to be. There might be some credit to be gained of it, but for this is too palpable due. "There is credit, and to spare," said I. "I assure you, Holmes, that I marvel at the means by which you obtain your results in this case, even more than I did in the Jefferson Hope murder. The thing seems to be deeper and more inexplicable. How, for example, did you describe in such confidence a wooden-legged man?" "Pshaw, dear boy! It was simplicity itself. I don't wish to be theatrical. It is all patent and above board. Two officers who are in command of a convict guard learn an important secret of a buried treasure. A map is drawn by them, an Englishman named Jonathan Small. Remember that we came upon that name in the chart of Captain Morstan's possession. He had signed it, in behalf of himself and his associates, the sign of the four, and somewhat dramatically called it. Aided by this chart, the officers, or one of them, gets the treasure and brings it to England, leaving, we will surmise, some condition under which he received unfulfilled. Now then, why should Jonathan Small get the treasure himself? The answer is obvious. The chart is dated at the time the Morstan brought it to the close attention of the convicts. Jonathan Small did not get the treasure because he and his associates were themselves convicts and could not get away. "But this is mere speculation," said I. "It is more than that. It is the only hypothesis which covers the facts. Let us see how it all fits in with the sequel. Major Sholto remains at peace for some years, happy in the possession of the treasure. Then he receives a letter from India, which he gives him a great fright. What was that?" "A letter to say that the men whom he had wronged had been set free." "Or had escaped. That is much more likely, for he would have known that their term of imprisonment was. It would have not been a surprise to him. What does he do then? He guards himself against a wooden-legged man, a white man, mark you, for the mistakes of a white tradesman for him, and actually carries a pistol at him. Now, only one white man's name is on the chart. The others are Hindus or Mohammedans. There is no other white man. Therefore, we may say with confidence that the wooden-legged man is identical with Jonathan Small. Does the reasoning strike you as being faulty?" "No, it is clear and concise." "Well, now, let us put ourselves in the place of Jonathan Small. Let us look at it from his point of view. He comes to England with the double idea of regaining what he would have considered to be his by rights, and by having revenge upon his man who had wronged him. He found that Sholto lived, and very possibly had established communications with someone on the inside of the house. There is the butler, Rao, whom we have not yet seen. Mrs. Bernstone gives him far from a good character. Small could not find out, however, where the treasure was hid, for no one ever knew, save the Major and one faithful servant who had died. Suddenly Small learns from the Major he is on his deathbed. In a frenzy lest the secret of the treasure die with him, he runs the gauntlet of guards, makes his way to the dying man's window, and is only deterred from entering by the presence of his two sons. Mad with hate, however, against the dead man, he enters the room that night, searches his private papers in hopes of discovering some memorandum relating to the treasure, and finally leaves the card. He doubtless planned before that, should he slay the Major, he would leave some such record upon the body as a sign that it was a common murderer. But from that point of view of the four associates, something in the nature of the acts of justice. Whimsical and bizarre conceits of this kind are common enough in the annals of crime, and usually afford valuable indications as to the criminal. Do you follow all this? Very clearly. Now, what could Jonathan Small do? He could only continue to keep a secret watch upon the efforts made by the treasure. Possibly he leaves England only to come back in tentacles. Then he comes to the discovery of the garret, and he is instantly informed of it. We again trace the presence of some confederates inside the household. Jonathan, with his wooden leg, is utterly unable to reach the lofty room of Bartholomew Sholto. He takes with him, however, a rather curious associate, who gets over this difficulty, but dips his naked foot into kerosite, whence come Toby and a 6-mile limp from the half-pay officer, with a damaged tendo Achilles. But it is an associate, not Jonathan, who committed the crime. Quite so. Rather to Jonathan's disgust, to judge by the way he stamped about when he got into the room, he bore no grudge against Bartholomew Sholto, and would have preferred if he could have been simply bound and gagged. He did not wish to put his head in the halter. There is no help for it. However, the savage instincts of his companion had broken out, and the poison had done its work. So Jonathan Small left his record, lowered the treasure box to the ground, and followed it himself. That was the train of events so far as I could decipher them out. Of course, as to the personal appearance of the must be a middle-aged man, and must be sunburned after serving some time in such an oven as Adamant's. His height is calculated readily from the length of his stride, and we know that he was bearded. His hairiness was one point that impressed upon himself. That is Sholto when he saw him at the window, and I don't know that there is anything else. Associates. Ah, well, there is no great mystery to that. But you will know all soon enough. How sweet the morning air is. See how that little cloud floats like a little pink feather from a giant flamingo. Now the red rim of the sun pushes it over against the London cloud bank. It shines on a good many folk, but on none, I dare bet, who are the stranger errand than you and I. How small we feel, with our petty ambitions and strivings, in the presence of great elemental forces of nature. Are you well up on your Jean-Paul? Fairly so. I worked back to him on Carlisle. That was the following of brook to apparent lake. He makes one curious, profound remark. It is in that chief proof that man's real greatness lies in the perception of his own smallness. It argues, you see, the power of compassion and of appreciation, it itself a proof of nobility. There is much good food, Sir Richter. You have not a pistol, have you? I have my stick. It is possible that we may need something of the sort if we get to the lair. Jonathan, I shall leave to you, but if the other turns nasty, I shall shoot him dead. He took out his revolver as he spoke, and having loaded 2 of the chambers, he put it back in his right-hand pocket of his jacket. We had during this time been following the guidance of Toby down half-rural, villa-lined roads which led to the metropolis. Now, however, we were beginning to come among the continuous streets, and the labourers and dockmen were already astir, and the slatternly women were taking down shutters and brushing doorsteps. At the squared-top corner public houses or buildings were just beginning, and rough-looking men were emerging, rubbing their sleeves across their beards after their wet morning. Strange dogs sauntered up and down and stared wonderingly at us as we passed, but our intimidable Toby looked neither to the right nor the left, but trotted onwards with his nose to the ground, and an occasional eager whine which broke out of a hot scent. We traversed Streatham, Brixton, Camberwell, and now found ourselves in Carrington Lane, having borne through some of the side streets to the east of the Oval. The men whom we pursued seemed to have taken a curious zigzag road, with the idea of escaping observation. They had never kept it to the main road, if a parallel side street would serve their turn. At the foot of Kensington Lane, we met with edged away with the left street of Bond Street and Miles Street. Where the latter street turns into Knight's Place, Toby ceased to advance and began to run backwards and forwards with one ear cocked and the other drooping, the very picture of canine indecision. Then he waddled round in circles, looking up to us from time to time, as if asking for sympathy for his embarrassment. "What the deuce is the matter with the dog?" growled Holmes. "They surely could not take a cab or go off in a balloon." "Perhaps they stood here for some time," I suggested. "Ah, it's all right. He's off again," said my companion, with a tone of relief. He was indeed off, for after sniffing around, he suddenly came up to his mind, and darted away with an energy and determination such as he had not yet shown. The scent appeared to be much hotter than before, for he had not even put his nose to the ground, but tugged at the leash and tries to break into a run. I could see by the gleam of Holmes's eyes that he thought we were nearing the end of our journey. Of course, now ran down 9 Elms until we came to Broderick and Nelson's large timber yard, just past the White Eagle Tavern. Here the dog, frantic with excitement, turned down through the side gates into the enclosure, where the sawyers were already at work. On the dog raced through the sawdust and shavings, down an alley, round a passage, between 2 large woodpiles, and finally, with a triumphant yelp, sprang upon a large barrel which stood upon the hand collie which it had been brought. With lolling tongue and blinking eyes, Toby stood upon the cask, looking from one to the other of us in a sign of appreciation. The staves of the barrel and the wheels of the trolley were smeared with dark liquid, and the whole air was heavy with the smell of kerosite. Sherlock Holmes and I looked blankly at each other, and then burst simultaneously into a controllable fit of laughter.